Okay. Uh, Good morning, David Morrison. A pleasure to be able to get to talk with you. We've
Glad to be here.
Thank you. I had the good fortune of starting to get to know you around the wireless and 5G about 6 months ago. Introduced through an attorney out of Santa Barbara, California, and
Julian Gresser, yeah.
yeah, Julian Gresser. And since then, I have been following your work and that of numerous other people through your work. And it's taken me around the country and making connections with folks around the world as well. So it's amazing how one connection can lead to many and increase the wealth of knowledge and connection. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, it's a relatively condensed international community, and everybody gets to know each other fairly quickly.
Yes. Well, David, I was wondering if you could just give me a little bit of your background, and as you do that, just kind of explain who you are and then how you initially became involved with the issue on wireless and 5G, because that will be a significant amount of what we'll talk about today.
Well, I'm a rare book dealer. I have no background in science or, anything technical really. But I had my daughter here in Portland, and we put her into a kind of a hoity-toity private school. And over one summer, they put a cell phone tower right in the middle of the school. So, I mean, intuitively, I did not feel good about that. So I asked the woman who runs the school what, what kind of research she did to, make sure that this is safe. And she said, well, she contacted, the World Health Organization website and the American Cancer Society. So I started doing research, and of course, the research, it's a rabbit hole. It's endless. And I contacted two scientists, Martin Blank, Dr. Martin Blank, who you've probably heard of. He's no longer with us. He wrote a book called Overpowered. He's a fantastic guy. And Henry Lai of the University of Washington. He was the first to discover DNA damage from the wireless. Both of them at the time, because it was some years ago, were fairly cautious in saying that there was definitely harm from this, but they implied, that there would be, that it was not safe. So I kept doing my research and finally had enough information that I took my daughter out of the school and put her in a public school, unbeknownst to me, where they use Wi-Fi. So I started doing research on that, and of course, realized that that's unsafe. So I began speaking to administrators and safety engineers, and writing letters, going to school board meetings, city council meetings, and of course getting nowhere. So then I think it was about 2011, I filed a lawsuit against Portland Public Schools under the 14th Amendment right to a safe environment for my daughter. And we got to we got into the suit far enough where we got to the oral arguments. It wasn't dismissed initially, which it could have been. And during the oral arguments, my attorney just was unable to argue the case. He just, for some reason, just became kind of, he couldn't speak very well. It was just really odd. He didn't have the argument somehow in his head. And so the judge didn't technically dismiss the case, but he said it was a complaint against the FCC using the argument of primary jurisdiction, where it didn't belong in the courts, it belonged complaint against the FCC. So of course that's hopeless. My witnesses that for the case were Barry Trower, Magda Havas, Curtis Bennett, David Carpenter, and Andrew Goldsworthy. My daughter and I, we went to England and we deposed, the Barry Trower and Andrew Goldsworthy, and we went to New York and spoke to David Carpenter and Magda Havas. And then when that was, obviously prior to when the lawsuit was dismissed, the local press at the time was basically ridiculed my case. They did a big story on the case, and I'll show you. This was the thing that they had on all of their
Oh, wow.
all of their newspaper, stands. It was the advertisement for the story. None of the local papers would do anything about it. The Washington Post had a story about the lawsuit, but no local papers touched it at all for some reason. Anyway, so I actually liked the judge because the judge said, I gain no satisfaction from this ruling, but, I feel it's a complaint against the FCC. So after that, I continued to work, against the Wi-Fi and the cell towers, going to city council meetings and all that stuff. I ran for school board twice and city council once. And school board, I got 17% of the votes just on the single issue, just on the statement so people are interested, and I met people afterwards who, met me and they said, they're really interested in that and they, hadn't done much about it. Working with the school board, I met one of the school board members, Steve Buell, who was very much on board with this. And he convinced the school board to stop, to not renew any of the leases for the cell towers in the schools. But in the end, they wound up renewing the leases despite their promises not to. And then through a Freedom of Information request, I found a letter from this woman who was in a care facility who had written a letter to the school board saying that everybody in her facility was getting cancer from this tower that was on school grounds right across the street from this facility. So I measured some of the cell towers in the schools, and one of the towers was literally a few feet from the upstairs windows. I mean, maybe like 20 feet from the kids. And the assistant to the principal said that the minute the tower went in, the kids all became noticeably jumpier. Well, I went back and I tried to find her, but she had, to get a real statement from her, but she had left and I couldn't really find her. So then, during all this, there was a web page to the Portland Public School Board that said that some parents are concerned about the wireless or the cell towers, but we've done our research and they're safe, but we're keeping up with all the science. Well, they weren't keeping up with the science. They didn't have anything about the NTP study or the World Health Organization Class 2B.
Talk about the NTP study, David, just so for people who don't.
The National Toxicology Study that was done by the National Institute of Health that determined clear evidence of harm. I think it was tumors to the heart, DNA damage, and also an increase in brain cancer in male rats, was it?
I believe so.
Interesting. So I contacted somebody from the who had been recruited by Portland Public Schools to deal with the asbestos problem. There's a huge asbestos problem in the water and all that stuff. So this fellow, John Berman, had been recruited especially to deal with this. Anyway, I spoke to him about the webpage and the NTP study, and I said the webpage had to be updated. And he was very interested. He didn't know about the NTP study. So we sort of, kept in touch, and he promised, that he was going to change. I actually haven't checked it to see if it's changed. I seriously doubt it. But anyway, so during that time, I was working with a couple of legislators. One legislator was the chair of the Senate Health Committee, Lori Monis Anderson, and a representative, Alyssa Kenny Geyer, who had previously introduced bills on our behalf, to look at science around the safety of school radiation exposure. So this was the third time now the bill is being introduced. And this time we had 12 sponsors, 3 of whom were Republicans. One of the sponsors, the Republican, Brian Boquist, was a Vietnam vet, and he insisted, he didn't just want to sponsor it, he insisted on being a chief sponsor because he said in Vietnam, everybody he knew got cancer from exposure to wireless one way or the other, literally everybody he knew. So we had a really strong, support for that. And I did, so I went to, so through John Burnham, the school safety chief, he had advised the school board chair, Julia Brim-Edwards, to support the bill, which was huge because, a school board member, usually, you don't get any interest. You just get dismissed completely. But she supported the bill. And, things kind of fell into place. The issue is kind of ripened with all these, the Ripon, California cell tower, kids getting cancer and all that stuff. The issues kind of come to fore and it's getting more, publicity. So I did a lot of lobbying, of course. I would go about every week or 10 days, I would go down to Salem to the Capitol, and I would leave bullet point information. I found out really that bullet points are the thing. They do not want to read a lot of material. They don't have time. I bought 90 copies of the Santa Clara Medical Association newsletter with Cindy Russell's, I don't know if you saw that, Cindy Russell's article. It was a cover article, Wireless Silent Spring.
No,
And it was fantastic. It had a big picture of a, frightening cell tower on the cover. And it was very, legitimate. It gave the issue a lot of legitimacy. So I handed those out to every legislator. I would meet with as many legislators as I could, despite their committee, assignments. I would just talk to as many people as I could. And during our hearing, and then we had a hearing for the bill. And so we had Paul Heroux came out from McGill University, and he was just fantastic. And we had a 14-year-old girl who was electrosensitive who had to leave school. She talked about her situation. And Dr. Paul Dart, who is a doctor in Eugene who treats electrosensitivity. And then Cindy Russell, who's with the California Brain Tumor Association. So we had a really strong hearing. And everything just kind of, moved in the right direction. And when the vote came, it passed unanimously in the Senate. and overwhelmingly in the House. I think there were like 5 people in the House who voted against it. Then the bill went to the Senate, went to the Oregon Health Authority, which now requires them to do a review of the science of the biological effects of radiation.
Let me interrupt you for a second, David. Can you just explain what the bill stated?
Well, the bill requires the Oregon Health Authority, I should have it in front of me because it's very short, but basically it requires the Oregon Health Authority to review the science showing the biological effects of radiation used in schools, particularly with, implements with the Wi-Fi routers and other devices, and come to a determination whether it's safe, and if, depending upon the determination, of lowering or eliminating exposure to children in the schools. So right now, I'm very happy to report that despite COVID and setting everything aside, the whole like complete erasure of everything else in our culture, they've recruited a couple of graduate students in public health who are going to do the review, and specifically of independently funded studies, not anything in industry funded. There have been studies like this. There was one, I think, in Seattle, which was a complete sham, and it was basically set up to fail. And I've met with David Howe, and I really think that I think you've talked to him too, I'm not sure, but.
I have not.
And I really think that he's a straight shooter. I think he wants to do a good job at this. So we'll see what happens. I don't know, how the review is going, but, of course I have my hopes.
David, so what was the time frame from the moment that you began to work on this bill to the time that it was passed and then signed and put into law by Governor Kate Brown?
Well, this time I think it was probably, a full legislative session, probably what's that, about a year or something, but it's the third time it was introduced. So I think back in maybe 2016, it was first introduced, maybe before that. And some years ago, we tried to get a cell phone warning bill, but that went nowhere.
So David, what in the world is going on that here we have our children in schools and we have school boards that are not open to hearing about the safety concerns that parents have that they're bringing forward? Where is the disconnect? What's your conclusion on this, that our children cannot be afforded a safe environment?
Well, I think it's like everything else. I think it is that people, I think they buy the industry. Industry creates a need. They create the curriculum. They create the devices. People themselves are addicted to their devices at home. And they still think that if it's in the schools, if it's out there, if industry is making these things, if our schools are accepting them, they must be safe. And then there's, of course, the disinformation campaigns by media that, they use the term conspiracy theorist, which is an instant way of dismissing something. So I think I think that they just think it's too big to fight, too big to consider. The conversations that I had, even when I showed science to safety engineers, they would say, well, these are cell phone studies. They don't have anything to do with Wi-Fi. That sort of thing. They want to believe they're bureaucrats. They want to believe, they don't want to make trouble. So they believe what's convenient. So there's a lot of things that are working, I think. And of course, we know there's not a single study that I know of that shows that any of this helps the learning process at all, but many studies that show that it harms learning. And, taking away teaching of cursive, I mean, just anything to do with brain development, they're removing in the schools, and they're just, I just think it's a disconnect on many levels.
Right. Well, and we have heard for many decades that there is a very intentional dumbing down of humanity.
Right. I'm
And
convinced, yeah.
yes, and so this is just obviously another part of that. So you've inspired many people with your spearheading of this and pushing this forward and being really, in many ways, the person who made this come into fruition, brought this into fruition as a bill. Are you seeing others picking up where you began and introducing these kinds of bills elsewhere?
Well, there was an effort, as you know, in Alaska, which would be the obvious place from, what we know about the Begich family and the work that they've done.
Right.
That was set aside, because of the COVID thing. But I'm sure it'll be picked up again because, they're very aware. And I think somebody contacted me about somebody that they know in California who's putting together something like this. So I think, there's a few people that are affiliated with Environmental Health Trust, I think, that are going to try to do something maybe in Massachusetts. But yeah, I haven't heard about too much.
Okay. Yes, it's Senator Tom Begich in Alaska. And I've spoken with him about this, and the timing was amazing with the COVID because he was introducing it in this legislative session. His brother, the eldest son of the family, Nick Begich Jr., is considered a conspiracy theorist because of his writing and his exposure of HAARP and his connections, connecting the dots of the MK Ultra program through the CIA and the use of wireless and 5G. And so we do know that conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists was coined by the CIA in the 1970s in a way to discredit anyone who brings up anything that is revealing information that the powers that be do not want brought forward. So
they know what they're doing.
Yes, they do. They do. Name calling. We've always known that name calling can go a long way, but we have to have thick skins, and we have to be ahead of them. It seems in everything.
You have to use better names.
We have to use better names. Yes, thank you. Excuse me. So, there's been activity in around the world in Europe. Daphne Takauer has been influential in eliminating or getting wireless out of schools in Israel. The French and the Italians have put limits on the exposure to children, hardwiring the computers, and in some cases not allowing any kind of Wi-Fi in the lower grades or in nursery schools. And of course, one would logically expect those things to happen. But for a country like the United States to be so backwards, so to speak, in terms of exposing our children to what we understand and know through over 30,000 studies that wireless technology is harmful to our DNA. It's harmful to our central nervous system. It interrupts and damages the mitochondria, and therefore it's as a communication structure and system to the nucleus of the cell. We understand on such a fundamental level the damages, and these are peer-reviewed scientific studies, non-industry funded. How is it that globally we have such a limited amount of say in something that is so harmful?
Well, I think you're seeing, the result of all that, the blowback from all that now with the demonstrations and the way COVID is being handled, with all the disinformation. It's profit over people, and we are the absolute apex of that, practice. We're just absolutely all about money, profit, and control, surveillance aspect, control. That's unfortunately why we are where we are. And the telecoms, they own the media, essentially. They fund all the, they fund OPB, and they fund,
What is it, David?
oh, I mean, like public broadcasting.
Oh, okay.
OPB is Oregon Public, but public broadcasting. So you'll get very limited information, as you know. You can't really go anywhere. Although the Washington Post just did a fairly decent, I don't know if you saw that.
Did not.
They did a fairly decent report, and Martin Paul is in it about 5G. I recommend everybody look that up, and it's fairly balanced. But yeah, I mean, we're country is corrupt.
I noticed. So it was January 30th, 2020, when the World Health Organization declared that there was a global pandemic, and it was not that long afterwards when there was mandatory requirements for people to stay at home and to not go to work, and then the term social distancing, again, another CIA term from the 70s. And yes, but I was very involved, along with you and others, pushing this resistance of the 5G rollout. And so I was, through you and others, really watching and participating in what was happening globally. I mean, we saw countries like Switzerland, where the cantons were refusing 5G, and people were protesting in large numbers, and the city of Brussels, the health minister had come out and said, I'm not going to expose my people as guinea pigs to the rollout of 5G. We are banning it in the city of Brussels. And so there was this huge buildup. It was happening. There was a force that was taking place. And I recall as if the faucet was turned off when the World Health Organization made their statement that because people could no longer gather, all of a sudden a halt came to all that momentum. It was as if a dam had suddenly been built in front of all of us globally. And we went smashing up into the dam, and there was silence until a regrouping began to happen. But did you notice that? Was your breath taken away? Mine was. At the power.
Well, at the towers?
At the power of
Power.
that declaration.
Oh, well, it's pretty amazing. I mean, my first, thinking was, especially after we see the various agendas that are being slipped into this, the agendas for surveillance, the agendas for what do they call contact tracing, all this new technology that's being, that's in the back pocket. Um, so, you know, I mean, I feel like I really don't know what's going on. With all the agendas, it makes it very suspicious. The timing, the fact that it appears now there's enough evidence that the virus was engineered. And so, the big question is it intentional? Um, does it matter? Because, a lot of people are getting sick, so there's certain things, that have to be done. But the whole aspect, as I mentioned before, of divide and conquer, we're in our houses and we all view each other now on some level as enemies. That person could be making me sick. That person isn't wearing a mask. There's all this kind of psychological psyops going on. And the one thing that really got me was that when I saw that they were going to start teaching social distancing like in preschool and kindergarten. And that just, the developmental aspects of that kind of mentality are frightening.
Well, it is very much Maoist in nature, and you train the children as young as possible, and you teach them to be afraid of one another, and you teach them to be afraid of breath and life and touch, and you control that entire generation for their entire lives until perhaps something significant knocks them awake somewhere in their 40s or 50s or 60s, and some never are knocked awake. So if that happens, we will have lost those generations to these heinous acts. Now, there's a retired British defense minister who was quoted in Daniel Estulin's book, The True Story of the Bilderberg Group. And in there, he says, all world events are that happen are intended and made, whether they're economic or social or political. So they don't just happen, they are orchestrated. And so that's, as I watch this as an anthropologist from Venus and you an anthropologist from Mars, as I watch this unfolding, every single incident that takes place does appear to have a connecting dot to it. And it happens, it appears to have an extended purpose in its connection. And as I look at and listen to doctors like triple board certified MD Zachary Bush, who talks about how the trillions and trillions of viruses are there on our behalf. We would not be alive today without viruses, and to demonize viruses is to demonize life. And that the science around viruses has been truly rewritten by captured agencies like the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control, and by people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is part of the National Institute of Health. And then, of course, by a self-proclaimed, I'm not sure what he is, but Bill Gates, who is wanting to vaccinate everybody around the world before they can go back and have a so-called normal life. So when we take life itself and it's demonized, these very aspects of life having to do with viruses, and we demonize them, and we tell people that we must be afraid of one another, and we teach that to preschool children, we are walking down a path of death at a very early age, a psychological death. We're taking away our sense of purpose, and that is to flourish, to thrive. and we're told to isolate, which is the antithesis of what it is about to be a human being. So what is your sense you live in Portland? What is your sense of people who actually believe this nonsense from the World Health Organization, the CDC, and the Bill Gates Foundation, and Anthony Fauci, and the governments that are attempting, and the bureaucrats and the elected politicians who are attempting to make us compliant? What is Portland like? Are people compliant, or are you seeing people rising up?
Well, I think, first of all, that social media has primed everybody, has basically, created a kind of a hive mind. Everybody gets the same news. Everybody gets a paragraph of information. Everybody is informed by their own opinions. And Portland, of course, is like the capital of political correctness. So it was interesting to watch the evolution. First, there was a kind of a shame, of walking around with a mask. A lot of people weren't walking around with a mask. And then it kind of became a social norm, I think. A lot of people, I think, use one for protection, but now it's kind of tipped into where if you're seen without a mask, that then you're not, part of the group. So I think people, and in Oregon, we're fortunate in that we don't have so many cases. My daughter's in the recovery community. She doesn't know a single person who has gotten this. She's got 1 million followers on Facebook. She put a notice out on Facebook. She hasn't gotten any replies from anybody who's been sick. We just had huge demonstrations here, with the Black Lives Matter events. And so far there's no, spikes in that community. There's spikes in the actual number of cases that are coming out on the graphs, but there are not, in a personal sense, I'm not seeing any increase in illness at all. So, Oregon is quick to jump onto trends, and what people think, I don't know. I'm fairly socially isolated myself.
I've found it very interesting, and I've been following this for some time, that the states that have Republican governors have more freedom. There's less mask wearing, there's less propaganda. The shutdown economically is less dramatic. If you look at states like Florida and Wyoming and the Dakotas and Oklahoma, compared to California and Washington and Oregon and New Mexico, where I am, and Colorado, where there are Democratic governors and Democratic mayors, and I find that political divide very interesting. And
in terms of how they handle it,
Yes, the Democratic governors are very totalitarian and very draconian and tyrannical about their signs and their postings and their fear-mongering on a weekly basis. And there's a principle, an 80-20 principle, that often applies to social situations where 80% of the people are compliant and 20% are not. And I've been following you know, in the more conservative areas of New Mexico, more in the south, and where there's more Republican elected officials. And I was talking to one House GOP representative, and he was saying that only 10% of the people in the southern New Mexico wear masks. And I said, well, you might be surprised to find out that about 99.999% of the people in Santa Fe are wearing masks. And he was surprised. And from contacts in Florida, where only about 10% of the people are wearing masks. And so, and we don't have these huge spikes in illness. And Dr. Zachary Bush says, you know, it's not like a virus jumps out and jumps on you. They're not even live, you know, and that is not the way that viruses behave. And so we have been fed a real line of BS about all of this. But what is very true and what we're seeing is that even the social distancing, even the stay-at-home orders, they've all been allowed by the people, because it's not as if there's going to be a police officer come and fine you or tell you that you are not social distancing. So this is, people are being compliant, and those who are wearing masks, as some people call it, you know, they show us who the army is, and those who aren't wearing the mask show who the people who are free are.
Well, what I've read is that the mask will help if you have the virus, or if you have something to transmit. It doesn't necessarily help protect you against, you know, if you're on a receiving end, but it keeps you from, you know, spreading the virus. Also, I've read things about winding up breathing too much carbon dioxide. You have a mask on so long. So, you know, I'm in a position where we are going to see from the Trump rally, from these various, you know, gatherings for the Black Lives Matter thing, we're going to see if that really, now we haven't seen any spikes from that in Oregon so far. It's been like more than 2 weeks. So that will be the sort of defining factor, I think, in terms of how we read this. Is there's a lot of disinformation, a lot of information. We hear one guy and then we find out that he's a plant, he's a shill, you know. I think there was some information about Dr. Shiva that he's supposedly a plant. So I kind of take the attitude that I don't disbelieve anything. And, you know, there's just so much around. And I try to focus as much as I can on the 5G. And haven't really followed that much about the virus.
Well then, David, where are we on 5G in terms of, you know, in terms of the reconnecting of that momentum of what was happening in the United States and then around globally? From your perspective, because I know, you know, 5G was being installed while we were staying at home. And I know in Santa Fe, the mayor had a virtual meeting without public input and installed Wi-Fi in schools and in public libraries and community centers. And people had no say in any of that. Now, and we heard about that happening across the country. So number one question for you is, you know, where do you think we are in terms of our impact on what is happening with the 5G rollout in this country? And maybe you could give a brief synopsis of what you are seeing globally.
Well, locally, I did a Freedom of Information request, and PPS, Portland Public Schools, says there's no 5G in the schools here and there's no intent to put in. I rode around to a few schools, not enough, to see if there's anything going on, because I was inspired by that video showing them putting it in, the schools. I think there's a lot of momentum globally about this. And we ourselves are going to use Andrew Campanelli, the attorney, who's been on several webinars, and he's pretty well known. We've engaged him to work with us in terms of, reviewing city codes and all that stuff, and then presenting that to our city council and telling him, look, you're negligent. If you do this, you're negligent. You have power to resist it. But I see, a lot of momentum globally around the world. The work that Josh Del Sol is doing, and then, I think, all the disinformation about that's come out from the mass media that considers people conspiracy theorists who connect 5G with the spread of the virus. Now that's debatable. However, all the disinformation, I think, has been good in terms of bringing the issue to people who didn't know about 5G. They say that any advertising is good advertising, right? So all these articles, and they have just been hundreds, have brought the issue out. So I think that's actually helping.
And isn't it interesting too, when there's resistance by the powers that be, the mainstream, and there's actually a tremendous amount of censorship. I've seen and heard from people saying that when they put up YouTubes or they put a posting on Facebook, and if there was any connection between 5G and COVID, it was taken down.
Right.
Well, who are these, gods who are determining what can be put out there for information? And why is that such a threat? If it's a threat, perhaps there is a connection, and it always makes me do a double take. And so I find it interesting how tremendously progressive the censorship has been, both in terms of the information on what is actually underlying this virus, and the impact of wireless technology and 5G has on human health, because those YouTubes that have been posted have been taken down almost as quickly as they've been put up. So it does give us information that is, it's hard not to see it these days, because as long as we're educated, as long as we are educated and empowered, then we have power. And we do know that lack of education keeps us in the dark. So yes, it is. It's been an interesting time to see what is censored and what we cannot say and what we cannot write.
Try posting something. Try posting something in Wikipedia. It'll be removed the same day.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, the power of truth is difficult to squash. Yeah. Well, I before we conclude, is there anything in particular that you'd like to add? Something that you'd like us as a takeaway for all of this at a time of unusual times in June 27th, 2000?
All of this, I mean, you were talking about people who are very spiritual, and I think a lot of people have to move in that direction just to survive. And I have a lot of anger about all this. I feel like, there's many scientists now who are saying that this is basically assault with a deadly weapon. And they're talking about lawsuits. Should we use the term assault or should we use the term battery? Which is more appropriate? One of them is certainly appropriate. And I just feel at a certain point, we may have to be taking things into our own hands and act in self-defense, whatever that means. And, that's just my own, difficulty that I have with this whole thing. But, good things are happening. A lot of people are jumping on board.
That is good. And people are connecting. And
Yeah.
I the connection from one community to another. And as I mentioned when we first started, to be able to get to know you through conversations and emails and conference calls has been really a pleasure. And I thank you for all the work that you have done and continue to do, and the exhaustion of it all. And but I really do, I really do think that that the masses will not be able to stay asleep forever, and 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 perhaps they will begin to see what is happening with their children and themselves as you.
Well, that'll be the final, yeah, when their kids get sick and they get sick, yeah.
Right. And thank you for being so attuned to your child and to life, because that is really what this is about. This is about life. This is about humanity and all the actions that are being perpetrated against life and against humanity. And so thank you for standing up for freedom and
Well, thank you. Thank you for what you do.
so in solidarity and in peace and thriving, we will we are.
The future is bright, but the road is long.
Yes. Thank you, David.
All right, thank you.